Hi, it's March 2020 and we're in lockdown due to coronavirus. So I'm unable to come and give this talk to you at the Civic Society, but I hope this film does just as well. Enjoy. What connects a peach, police mugshots, a coffin and a lighthouse to this building? The answer is the library clock. Although this talk is about the clock and its unusual connections, and not really about the library itself, the two are, of course, inextricably linked. Some of you, at least, will know much more about the library itself than I do, but this building, the best public edifice in the town, has been a major asset to Clitheroe ever since it was opened back in 1905. It is, of course, a Carnegie library, part funded by the Scottish-American Andrew Carnegie from the fortune he made from the US steel industry. Between 1883 and 1929, he gave close to 90% of his fortune to charitable causes, the largest proportion funding more than 2,500 free libraries. So Clitheroe is just one amongst many. But what interests me about this is that Clitheroe, not usually at the forefront when free money is available, was the first in this region to benefit. Of the towns that surround us, Accrington was opened in 1907, as was Rawtenstall. Darwin, which Andrew Carnegie himself attended, was 1908. Oswald Twizel was 1915, whilst Burnley didn't open its doors till 1928. Blackburn's missing from this list. It didn't need Carnegie funds, having its own purpose-built library as long ago as 1874, coincidentally built in Library Street. Given the quality of the building, it isn't surprising that a full civic opening ceremony was planned for our library, but not being profligate with taxpayers' money, the council had the wizard wheeze of combining with another public occasion that was about to be celebrated all across the country: the centenary of the Battle of Trafalgar and the death of Britain's greatest naval hero.
On the 21st of October, before the rising sun, we formed a line for action, boys, at 12 o'clock begun. There's many a brave commander, with grief he shook his head, but their grief had no relief, for Nelson he lay dead. It was the fatal musket ball that caused our hero to fall, that caused our hero to fall. On board a man of war, let him die in peace. God bless you all. On board a man of war, let him die in peace.
So the programme for the opening, including the Mayor's luncheon, held in the upper room of the Town Hall, then immediately behind the new building, shows one H.B. Inglefield, Esquire, to give the toast "The Immortal Memory of Lord Nelson," just before the new clock was to be started. Well, as son of a family of Royal Naval Admirals, and therefore a very suitable person to give the toast, Henry Beaufort Inglefield was guest of honour. His grandfather, Admiral John Nicholson Inglefield, had been Royal Naval Commissioner in Gibraltar when the shattered ships arrived there after Trafalgar, including, of course, HMS Victory, which arrived there 7 days after the battle, with Nelson's body preserved in its barrel of brandy, camphor and myrrh. The barrel had been lashed to Victory's mainmast, guarded by 2 Marines. But there was another familial connection. Henry's great-uncle by marriage had been one of Nelson's band of brothers. Captain, later Admiral Benjamin Hallowell, missed Trafalgar. His ship had been sent to resupply and rewater. But he had been at the Battle of Aboukir Bay, also known as the Battle of the Nile, on the 1st and 2nd of August 1798 that many experts consider a greater victory than Trafalgar. While much of that battle was fought in the dark, Nelson was wounded in the head at approximately 8:30 p.m. He thought it was fatal, but he was there on the deck on hearing that the French flagship L'Orient was on fire. At 10 o'clock, in the middle of an intense cannon fire, L'Orient, at 120 guns, by far the biggest warship employed, at least a third bigger than any other ship, blew up. One minute it was there, the next gone, taking 1,000 men with it. The sound was heard many miles away in the Egyptian desert, and it was such an apocalyptic event for all the people involved that it effectively stopped the battle for 10 to 15 minutes. Nobody, Nelson included, had ever seen anything like this. Morning light showed the shambles that Aboukir Bay now was. Most of the French ships had surrendered or run themselves on shore. Hallowell's ship, Swiftsure, helping to pick up survivors, also picked up part of L'Orient's mainmast, shattered in the blast. Hallowell passed this massive timber to his ship's carpenter, and after Swiftsure's damage had been repaired, prepared to give his commander a souvenir. Some days later, the souvenir arrived on Nelson's ship Vanguard, with a letter from Hallowell. It read, "Sir, I have taken the liberty of presenting you with a coffin made from the mainmast of L'Orient, that, when you finish your military career, you may be buried in one of your trophies. But that period may be far distant, is the earnest wish of your sincere friend, Ben Hallowell." Well, Nelson kept the coffin. It followed him from Vanguard to Foudroyant to Elephant, Medusa, and finally HMS Victory. It was in his cabin on the 21st of October 1805 as his fleet sailed in to decimate the combined French and Spanish fleets. The legend is he kept his wine and spirits in it. At his state funeral on the 9th of January 1806, he was, I believe, the first commoner to be allowed a full state funeral, and there have only been two others, those of the Duke of Wellington and Winston Churchill. His body lay in state in this coffin, now heavily embellished, at the Royal Naval Hospital, Greenwich, before being transferred, first by royal barge, then on a hearse built to replicate HMS Victory, to St Paul's. After the committal service, the coffin was lowered through the floor, where it still lies within a sarcophagus in the cathedral crypt. Now, I'd long known the story of the coffin, but it was great to find this connection to our library, and to read in the Clitheroe Advertiser that H.B. Inglefield had related its story in his address. I'm sure it was a tale that he regularly dined out on. So after toasting the health of Andrew Carnegie and some Scottish airs played by the band, everyone processed to the reading room at the library, and the mayoress, there she is, started the new clock at the rather odd time of 2:43 p.m. Now, I've tried to ascertain if that time had a particular relevance. Did it relate to a specific time, that something else relating to the clock or the day referenced? But I've found nothing specific. Nelson was hit by the sniper's bullet at approximately 1:15 p.m. and died at 4:30, so it wasn't for that. The other major event that I'll shortly be relating took place at night, but I do think I might have an answer, which I'll tell you later. Now, we all know the clock, housed in the top room of the library, where the mayoress cut a red silken ribbon that held back the pendulum and set the W. Potson sun mechanism going. And on the case was the plaque, giving details of its presentation, as can be clearly seen. Why is the plaque in such a state? Surely it should be cleaned, returned to its original glory, which I'm able to do using computer programming. It certainly deserves better, doesn't it? But here we see exactly why the then mayor and his two brothers donated the clock, in the main part to memorialise two of their brothers who drowned in a terrible wreck 9 years before. So let's look at the doomed ship, the Drummond Castle. Well, she was built in 1881 by John Elder and Co. of Glasgow, so Clyde built. She was 365 feet in length, and unladen was just over 3,500 tons. Her steam engines powered a single screw that gave her a cruising speed of 12 knots. She could carry 120 first-class passengers, 100 second-class, 160 third-class, and 103 crew. Her Castle Line idents were red funnel with a black top, and the Castle Line house flag, the Scottish saltire, with a central white diamond carrying the red letter C. The name itself was actually another house ident. All Castle Line ships were named after castles. It was in 1862 that Scotsman Donald Currie established the Castle Shipping Company, which firstly ran sailing ships between Liverpool and Calcutta around the Cape of Good Hope. The opening of the Suez Canal in 1869 saw the company having to adapt its business model, and it now ran the Royal Mail service to and from South Africa. Later, in 1900, Castle Line would merge with the Union Line to become Union Castle, and that survived till 1977. Its last ship, the equally famous Windsor Castle, finally went to the breaker's yard in 2005. But back to the Drummond Castle. One of its claims to fame was that she had a cold chamber, early refrigeration, fitted in 1892, and brought the first cargo of peaches from South Africa to England, and they apparently arrived in excellent condition. But there is also a story that she was blamed for bringing smallpox to Cape Town in 1882, leading to the deaths of some 800 people. Apart from that, she was a well-built, if ordinary, intermediate steamship of the time, running the UK-South African route in conjunction with her identical sister ship Garth Castle when she left Cape Town on the 28th of May 1896 on her fateful last voyage. Her journey had actually started 10 days before in Delagoa Bay, now in Mozambique, via Durban, East London, Port Elizabeth, and on round the Cape of Good Hope on the Standard Mail run and picking up passengers as she went before her final African stop in Cape Town. There, the two Whipp brothers, Fred, 32, and Walter, 29, came aboard as first-class passengers. Records indicate they'd been in South Africa for some 9 months, Walter having travelled there for his health, with his elder brother accompanying him. Walter was by now fully recovered. Well, the ship was only half full of passengers as it left Cape Town, extra space having been allowed for cargo. But there was still 143 men, women and children, plus 102 crew. Only 3 would survive to tell the tale. Percentage loss of life would be much greater than on Titanic 16 years later. It would be Castle Line's worst disaster. There were the usual tales of good fortune, people who'd been booked to board and that had cancelled at the last minute. And the reverse. The last passenger on the list was a last-minute addition. One young man was returning home to be married. 2 Norwegians were sailing home from Delagoa Bay after already surviving a shipwreck that had left them destitute. One whole family had been booked on a previous ship when the father was delayed. Sending them off safely on that previous ship, he would now be lost with Drummond Castle. The loss of breadwinners would leave many families in South Africa and Great Britain in dire straits. The captain, W. Pierce, from Dawlish, Devon, went down with his ship. He'd gone to sea with Castle Line at the age of 14, had held a master's certificate for 17 years, and was well respected. But none of this mattered, as good weather gave them a comfortable passage of 2 weeks to Tenerife, where they would have a refuelling stop. Just 5 days and they'd be back in England. And then they neared the English Channel, the western approaches, a danger point though it doesn't look it. All you seem to need to do is sail due north, then turn to starboard, and it's straight up the channel. But the tides and currents swirl around Finistère, the end of France, and round and between the islands that stand off to its west, Ushant and the Ponant Islands. On the evening of 16th of June, a concert was held for passengers in the saloon, and then most of them went to their cabins, as it wasn't inviting out on deck. The sea was calm, but it was drizzling and visibility was poor. Despite the haze, Captain Pierce was happy about the ship's position and didn't see the need to reduce speed. He didn't realise his ship was being pulled eastwards by a strong current. A tramp steamer, the Verfa, saw Drummond Castle about 10 p.m. and noted she was off course, but had no radio to contact her. Visibility had reduced further, and with a calm sea there were no waves breaking to indicate rocks or reefs. And at 11 p.m, Drummond Castle, still travelling at 12 knots, struck the reef, known as the Pierres Vertes, close to Ile Molène. Within a few minutes, she'd gone to the bottom, bows first.
Now I'm a sailor lost at sea. Without you, I'm alone here in the deep. Without you, caught in wind and waves, holding my last breath. Without you, I'm shipwrecked.
Many were drowned in their cabins. Those that made it onto deck in the 4 minutes before she sank stood no chance in the cold waters, dressed, as most were, in their pyjamas or nightshirts. There were just 3 survivors: Petty Officer Charles Wood, Seaman William Godbolt, and a single passenger, Charles Marcotte, all of whom were hauled out of the water by local fishermen the following morning and landed on Ile Molène. And then, as bodies were washed ashore on both Ile Molène and Ushant, they were gathered up and treated with great dignity by the locals, long used to tragedy from the sea. Fishermen searched the waters for other survivors, only to bring back more bodies. A few years later, French post-impressionist painter Charles Coté painted Douleur, also called Victims of the Sea, which well captures the Bretons' collective grief over a body recovered from the ocean. Charles Coté, here's his self-portrait, had lived amongst these islanders, and he was on Ushant at the time of the loss of Drummond Castle, and where 6 bodies at least were quickly recovered. Within months of the tragedy, he produced this work. It shows a dead child being mourned. This incredibly moving image is believed by many to represent Alice Reed, one of the children lost with the Drummond Castle. Now here's a report of what happened. Some bodies were recovered quite quickly. The mayor, Victor Masson, and the rector, Guillaume Lejeune, organised a reception of the bodies, which were placed in the café of the widow Calandre. A number was assigned to each corpse and notes made of each one for future identification. The bodies were cleaned and then dressed in shrouds. At the head of each body was placed a crucifix and candles lit. Madame Calandre took special care of the child's body, which she placed in her bedroom in a cradle decorated with flowers. Throughout the day and all night long, the Molène people watched the dead in turn in the pure Christian, island and Breton tradition. And here is Madame Seraphique Calandre. The number of bodies recovered continued to rise, 53 in total. There being little available wood on the island, the bodies were simply buried in their shrouds. But now enter Alphonse Bertillon of the French Sûreté, a real-life maigre. Chief of Criminal Identification, he was called in to identify some of the corpses. So famous was he that he was referenced by Conan Doyle in The Hound of the Baskervilles, where one of Sherlock Holmes' clients refers to Holmes as the second highest expert in Europe after Bertillon. And Bertillon was also involved in the notorious Dreyfus affair. He developed the mugshot format and other photographic procedures now used by police across the world. Photographing of criminals actually began back in the 1840s, but it wasn't till 1888 that Bertillon standardised the process. He compiled details of physical characteristics in an attempt to identify repeat offenders, a system he called anthropometry, i.e. measuring humans, and it included body measurements, photographs and fingerprints. Other forensic techniques stem from Bertillon as well, using plaster of Paris compounds to preserve footprints, using ballistic science, and methods for determining the force used in breaking and entering. With his techniques, he identified most of the 27 unknown victims. He would receive a gold medal from Queen Victoria for his services here. Well, on Ushant we read that Friday afternoon, that's 3 days after the sinking, saw one of the most pathetic and imposing ceremonies in Ushant's memory. Thousands of locals, dressed in their picturesque yet traditional Sunday costumes, gathered on green slopes leading to the old rescue station where the bodies were placed. This building has been transformed into a chapel of a very beautiful character. The interior is decorated with black and white drapery, decorated with flowers, whilst the front of the wall where the bodies rested was hidden with the Union Jack and lifebelts found on the bodies. The kneeling women, often accompanied by their children with bewildered eyes, walked along the centre of the little chapel and said prayers in their rosaries. The whole was a moving and overwhelming spectacle, and a striking example of piety, simplicity, and deep consideration for the dead of these good and humble islanders. The burial of Alice Reid was the most moving. Her tiny coffin, draped in white linen, was carried by a young woman whose daughter preceded her with a wreath of small white flowers. On Molène, 29 bodies were buried. The cemetery is still well cared for. Newspapers in Britain, South Africa and around the world were full of the disaster. A Board of Trade Wreck inquiry was held in July 1896 in Westminster, and the inquiry concluded that the loss was due to careless or unskillful navigation. In debates in the Houses of Parliament, the government was encouraged to send an official vote of thanks to the French government and to the islanders of Molène, which was done. Queen Victoria was so moved by the care taken in recovering the bodies and the reverence with which the dead were treated that the fishermen of La Molène and its rector, Monsieur Le Jeune, were all awarded medals for their work. But there were other gifts to Molène. There was a need for a fresh water system on the island. It now lies below this pavement. That was provided from a Breton fund set up with a main donation from Donald Currie and the Castle Line. Subscriptions had been opened in London and Cape Town, firstly for the relief of families who would suffer financial distress, but this was an extra. The Archbishop of Canterbury gifted a splendid chalice to the island. But there was an even more significant result from the tragedy. Though there had been literally hundreds of wrecks in these selfsame waters, it was the wreck of Drummond Castle that led to the erection of a lighthouse. It took a number of years of planning, but construction of La Jument began in 1904 and was completed in 1911. And you may have unwittingly seen this lighthouse before, because it became world famous after providing famous French photographer Jean Guichard with some great poster images that were all around in the 1980s and 90s. Or even more remarkable, with the lighthouse keeper stood in the doorway just as that giant wave breaks against the tower. He was awaiting rescue apparently, heard the helicopter and thought it was coming to lift him off. He nipped back and shut the door pretty damn quick as the wave burst round him. But there are now more navigation marks to help sailors in the treacherous waters that claim Drummond Castle. Here is La Jument Light. Here a light buoy marking the Pierres Vert reef that claimed our ship. And here the Nividic lighthouse. But what about the two Whipp brothers? Well, the body of Fred was found on Ile Molène, where he was buried on the 17th of June. The body of his brother Walter was later found in Ushant. Though his burial was scheduled for 18th of June, friends and relatives of the Whipp brothers asked that that be delayed pending their arrival in Ushant on the 19th of June. On arrival they asked not only that Walter not be buried, but also requested exhumation of Frederick's body so they could be returned to England. But that was initially refused by British Consul Hoare, and Walter was indeed buried on Ushant on the 20th of June. 2 days later, orders were given to immediately exhume the bodies of the two brothers in the presence of a family representative and the fishermen who discovered the bodies. By the 23rd of June, the bodies, in double coffins of lead and oak, were in the port of Brest. They were then to be taken to the station to be brought to Clitheroe, but at the last moment it was decided they would be buried there. It was said that their arrival at Clitheroe would inflict too much emotion on their frail 73-year-old mother. So, in the end, the two brothers were buried in the Brest Public Cemetery on the 25th of June. The mourning was led by their brother Robert Whipp and a Dr. Mercer, who was their cousin, and Messrs. Hoare and Bonner, the English consul and vice-consul, were there. Wreaths were provided by the castle line. Well, after the design for the new library was agreed, and with John Whipp as mayor, he and his elder brothers, Edward and James, proposed that the family should donate a clock in memory of Fred and Walter. A further brother, William, had died since the Drummond Castle tragedy, so he too would be memorialised. That the addition of the clock was an afterthought is clear from this artist's impression that appeared in the Clitheroe paper immediately after the design had been agreed, because if I enlarge the top part of the tower, you can, I think, see that no clock is there, just a window. But ever since the 21st of October 1905, the clock has stood over Marketplace and given the heart of this town a true centrepiece. But my story doesn't end just yet, because our clock has a twin. Not an identical twin by any means. In fact, it's 8 years older and doesn't even have the same parentage. But for this, we've got to return to Ilmolen and the St. Ronan Church, where 29 of the Drummond Castle victims still lie. The church hasn't changed much, except for the installation of a clock. Back in 1896, no one on Molen had a watch, so we're told, and when the Breton Fund, the British charity set up after the wreck, asked the islanders what, besides the freshwater cistern, would be useful to them, they asked for a big clock striking the hours to inform the workers in the fields and which would be visible out to sea. Put out to tender to well-known clockmakers, it was designed by London watchmaker John Hock. The clock, with three faces pointing north, south and east, was installed in 1897, and alongside is a plaque that reads, "In the shade of this church rest 29 people who perished in the sinking of the English ocean liner Drummond Castle, lost in the passage of Fromveur during the night of June 16, 1896. In grateful memory of the pious care lavished by the inhabitants of the Ile Molène to the unfortunate victims of this catastrophe, the clock of this church and the neighbouring cistern were donated by the English people." So, 2 clocks, 2 plaques, 1 wreck, and a number of curious connections. But there's one last connection here, and that is with the vanished industry of the town, because the Whipp family money came from cotton. The brothers owned Fowlside Mill that stood off George Street, of some 14,000 spindles, and where, coincidentally, they developed flame-proof flannelette, and Victoria Mill on what was then called Wilking, plus they had a mill in Darwin. So cotton funded the clock. So King Cotton, shipwreck, Nelson's coffin, peaches, police mugshots, and a lighthouse. Who'd have thought that our town clock would have such a story? Now, I hope you've enjoyed that film. I certainly enjoyed putting it together for you. And I mentioned in the film that I might have an idea as to why the clock was started at the seemingly random time of 2:43 p.m. Now, it could just simply be that that gave people time to finish their lunch, progress through into the library and start the clock going in order to then hear it chime for the first time at 2:45. But I just wonder whether in fact it might be the time that the two Whipp brothers were buried in the public cemetery in Brest. It's just an idea, but if anybody can confirm that or refute it, I'd really be interested to hear from you. Also, if anybody has any images of the Whipp brothers, that would be great to see. Thanks very much for watching.